Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to wrap up our discussion on the basics of spatial analysis by talking about the last basic spatial analysis tool that we're going to discuss, and that's going to be union. So to recap where we've left off so far, we talked about intersect, which only keeps the geometry where you have overlap. We've looked at symmetrical difference, which removes only those areas of overlap and keeps everything else. And we've looked at identity, which keeps the areas of overlap and then the geometry of one of the inputs. So our last option is going to be similar to identity, but instead of only keeping one, it is going to keep both. And again, that is going to be the idea of union. Union. So with union, again, what we do is we retain, try and make that a little bit cleaner, right? We retain the geometry of any overlaps as well as the geometry of both inputs. And then just like we've been talking about before, right, all attributes are retained. Okay, so just to recap, right, the idea with union is basically that we're keeping all possible geometries. We're keeping both input geometries that don't overlap, as well as any areas where they do. And then we're keeping all of the attributes. Okay. So let's go ahead and take an example of the video for an example for union. So let's go ahead and do our handy dandy example using the wetlands and construction sites. Okay. To keep things a little more simple, just because we have so many output geometries, we're actually going to worry about just two wetlands. So we'll have our fen and our coastal. And we're going to have just three construction sites. Smith, Marshall, and Jones. Right, and so again, what we have is we have wetlands in green with an attribute type for the wetland type. And then we have the construction sites in gray. With the attribute owner. Okay. So what happens when we run union? Well, when we run union, what we end up with is the geometry of any overlaps. So let's find our overlaps. We have an overlap here, 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 and here, right? As well as the geometry of both inputs. So basically anything that doesn't overlap is retained as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best to try to draw these out. So the first thing we have is going to be the geometry of this construction site minus the overlap. Right? So our first polygon in the output is going to look something like that. That's polygon 1, polygon 1, right? The second polygon is going to be the overlap between the Smith construction site and the Fenn wetland. Okay. The third polygon is going to be the parts of the Fenn that are not overlapped by construction site. Right, and so just trying to do my best here to complete. Right, this is going to be this, right? Because again, the first was one of the inputs. The second was an area of overlap. The third is the non-overlapped area from the second input. And then, so we have 4 going to be the area of overlap between Fenn and Marshall. 5, right, is going to be that area of Marshall that is not overlapped by Fenn or coastal. All right, 6 is going to be the area of overlap between Marshall and coastal. Give ourselves a little bit of room here. I might have made these a little too, yeah, we're gonna run out of room. So let's go ahead and just pretend that we can squeeze these in here. Right, so coastal is gonna look something like that. Right, so this is gonna be 7. 7 is going to be the coastal that does not have overlap. Right, 8 is going to be this little area. Let me fix that. 8 is going to be that area of overlap between coastal and Jones. And then finally, trying to squeeze this in here at the very end, we have Jones being 9. What's left of Jones minus the overlap. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a step back and talk through what just happened. Right? What we had originally were 2 inputs, right? Wetlands, which are the green circles, and construction sites, which were the gray squares. When we ran a union, what we got was a polygon for each of the unoverlapped areas. So 1 was the unoverlapped area of this construction site. 3 was the unoverlapped area of this wetland. Right? 5 was Marshall, and so on. But then we also got new polygons for the areas of overlap. So the overlap area between Smith and Fenn became polygon 2. The overlap area between Fenn and Marshall became polygon 4, and so on. So what we ended up with in the union was the geometry of the overlaps, right? 2, 4, 6, 8, as well as the geometry of both inputs, right? 1, 3, 5, and 7, and so on. So we ended up, unlike the other ones where we were either focused explicitly on overlaps, removing overlaps, or having the overlaps in one data set, with union now we have everything. We have both inputs as well as all of the overlaps. But let's take a second and talk about the attribute table. The attribute table for this data set is going to look something like this, right? So we have our features in the output data set. So we'll do it just like before. We'll do the first. Let's do the first 4, and then we'll skip down and we'll do 7, 8, and 9. Okay. So let's go ahead and get it so we can see everything. All right. So again, our definition of the union was that we retained all of the attributes. So what does that mean, right? Just like with all the others, it means that we're going to have for each feature, let me move that up a little bit. Give myself a little bit more room. Right, that for each feature in the output, we're going to have a type. And again, this type is coming from wetland, and we're going to have an owner. This owner is going to be coming from the construction site. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at the first polygon in our output, which is this one right here. So if we link this back up to our inputs, right, this first polygon here is going to be Smith, or the construction site owned by Smith, minus the overlap of Fenn. So its owner is going to be Smith, and we've already seen this before when we looked at symmetrical difference, right? Or intersect, for that matter. Or sorry, identity, I should say. We looked at identity, right? So if we look at just the part of Smith that does not overlap Fenn, right, it has no wetland type, right? There's no wetland type for this area here. So it's going to have a type of null, right? And we've seen null pop up a lot of times. Again, null is just this idea that we have nothing there, right? There is no value for this attribute because there is no wetland type for a construction site that doesn't overlap, right? So let's go ahead and look at 2. 2, right here, to remind everyone, even though I kind of drew it poorly, represents this piece of overlap here between the construction site owned by Smith and the wetland of type Fenn. So its type is going to be Fenn, right? Think back to our video on intersect when we talked about the attribute table, right? If you have overlap, you're pulling in the attributes from each piece of the overlap. So it's pulling in the type from the overlap part of Fenn, and it's going to pull in the owner Smith from the overlapped construction site. Right? So 2, being the result of an overlap, is going to have both a type from the wetland overlap as well as an owner from the construction site overlap. Okay. Let's look at 3. 3, again, is going to represent the area of this wetland with type Fenn that is not overlapped by any construction sites. So it is also going to have a type of Fenn, right, because it's pulling the Fenn from right here. The owner, though, right, again, this is the non-overlapped portion of the input. So we actually don't have any owner, so it's going to be null. Okay. So let's look at one more of this set. Let's look at 4, right? So 4 in the output is represented of the input of the overlap between the input Fenn wetland of type Fenn, and the input construction site with the owner Marshall, right? It's this piece right here, this overlap. So in terms of owner, right, it's going to pull its owner from the construction site. So its owner is going to be Marshall, and it's going to pull its type from nothing, or from the overlap with wetland type Fenn, right? Because this piece right here has the owner Marshall and the wetland type Fenn. Okay. So we've gone through 4 attributes, and hopefully you can see how this is working. That if the original input geometry did not overlap, it's only going to have the attributes of one of the inputs. If the output geometry is the result of an overlap, then it's going to have attributes from both. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump down and look at 7. So 7 in our output represents this coastal type wetland that has no overlap. So its type is going to be coastal. But again, as we just mentioned, right, it's the part that has no overlaps, so it's going to have no owner. Right, null. Let's look at 8. So 8 in our output represents the overlap in the inputs between the wetland of type coastal and the construction site with owner Jones. So it's going to have an owner, as we just said, of Jones, and it's going to have a type of coastal. Right? Because again, the output 8 is the overlap between these two inputs. So we're drawing the wetland type from the wetland half of the overlap and the owner from the construction site half of the overlap. And then finally, looking at 9, 9 in the output is the area of Jones that is not overlapped by a wetland. So its owner is going to be Jones, and its attribute type is going to be null. Because again, right, Jones minus the overlap has no wetland type associated with it. So hopefully this makes sense, this idea of union. Just to recap what we've done, right, when we have two inputs, the output from union is going to be any areas that have no overlap from both data sets, so for example 1 and 3, as well as new polygons created for any areas of overlap, and that's where this 2 here came from, because that is the area of overlap between Smith and Fenn. And then the attribute table is going to retain both attributes. Anywhere where there is an overlap, it's going to pull attributes from both sets. Anywhere where there's not an overlap, it's only going to retain its original attributes, and it's going to have a value of null for any of the others. Hopefully this all makes sense, and if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Thank you.